Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners, and a very happy New Year to you all.
Indeed. We've had a great 2022, one of the most crazy and disruptive years in our time, only made less so by what came before it. We're all hoping that 2023 is a more serene year that comports to what John McCain called regular order. We shall see. It's going to be a big year in the Thomas Jefferson Hour, but before we move on, we wanted to look back. That's what Janus stands for, the god in Rome of looking forward and back. And so we do a program at this time almost every year in which we look back on some of the highlights of the previous year's Jefferson Hours. 52. You know, David, most podcasts and public radio programs do 13 episodes or maybe 26 episodes per year. For some reason, we got into the habit of doing all 52, and I love it, I have to say. I love the idea that no week goes by in my life for the past 30 years. Imagine this. For the past 30 years, no week has gone by in my life when I didn't put on the mantle, in some sense or other, of Thomas Jefferson and try to understand him and the world that he dreamed into being, and his quirks and inconsistencies and paradoxes, etc. It's been the greatest single devotion and commitment of my life, and I think for half of that time, more now, for 18 years, I think, you have been the semi-permanent guest host of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. You came in to do
18?
something. I came back in 2005. You do the math.
I think it's time to renegotiate.
Yeah. What, you want money?
No, but I gotta, you know, I have to correct you. And it's my fault. But this year, I think we only did 50.
No.
There were a couple, you know, and it was my fault because
you were busy with another big thing.
Yeah. And so I went back and re-edited 2 shows that were absolute favorites of mine, but who's counting? 50's pretty darn good.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that. We slipped.
We'll make it up somehow.
I'll do 54 this year.
I know what. We can do some extra long podcast intros to make up for it.
Yeah, exactly. If you think we do 52 hours per year, and then there's how much time we spend in podcasts between 8 and 20 minutes. And
well,
you're always
how
saying
much?
less.
Yeah. And the time that I have to spend doing research and reading just to keep up with you, sir. Which, you know, I'm not complaining. I really enjoy that.
True Jefferson Hour listeners love the podcast introductions, and they are sorry that you are constantly trying to constrain them.
I'm over that. I'm not doing it anymore.
Well, I do think you're right. But here's my point. Jefferson is a central figure in my existence. If you had asked me when I was 20 years old, if maybe the main focus of my life's work would be about some guy who lived in a domed house in Virginia, who was kind of a universal genius of a certain sort, but who also, you know, had like a whopping fundamental issue at the center of his life, and that issue would eventually come back to like be the central story now, I would have said this will never happen. I was an English professor, an English major. My interest was John Donne and Milton and Shakespeare and classical languages and literature. I started doing Jefferson as kind of a lark for a friend of mine, and it took, and here we are. And I walked into your studio when I moved back to my beloved North Dakota in 2005, because I had worked with you a little bit on some important Lewis and Clark projects and had a great admiration for your work, and said, would you host the Jefferson Hour for a few weeks until such time as I figured out what to do next with it? And you said, sure, I'll do a couple of weeks. Why not? How hard can that be?
That's not exactly my perspective on it.
What's your story?
Well, I was, I'm easily flattered, and I was that I am, and oh wow, this guy, Clay Jenkins, he wants me to, oh my.
Yeah, that's before you knew enough to.
That's when the research started, and I remember very well our very first show. It was about Jefferson and his gadgets. he was, he's just fascinated by gadgets. And
I'd like to hear that show in its entirety sometime. It'd be interesting.
Well, if we have to rebroadcast.
We were both nervous.
Our voices were much higher back then.
Wow. But that was a long time ago now, and so that at some point,
I've learned so much from you, and from the associated reading and research that I've done. And one of the things that you said to me that you probably don't even remember that just stuck with me, and this was a few years back, said, you've really, you've earned the equivalent of some kind of a degree. I can't remember what you said in Jefferson studies. And I was going like, wow, the professor rewarded me.
No, it's true. You've done hard reading, and you do a lot of research, and you try very hard to be on top of all the material. And it shows, and you're also many other things. You're the audience's representative on the show. You're the person who tries to reset the balance when things get a little extreme.
Good luck with that, right?
You bring humor to the program. People can hear the quality of the friendship. And at some point, I don't think I any longer remember this, but maybe you do. At some point, I called you the semi-permanent guest host of the. But when was that?
I don't know. It'd be fun to find that.
And then at some point, someone sent you.
It probably started right away in the beginning because I was sort of a fill-in.
Well, you were temporary.
Yeah.
And then you were semi-permanent. But remember, somebody sent you an office plaque.
I have it.
That says, that you have that. No one sends me squat, of course.
I keep it in front of me when I do the programs to remember my place.
And I think you take a certain pride in semi-permanent guest hosts.
Oh, I do. We get new listeners who write in, why is the guy's okay? Give him a title. And I was like, no, that's my title.
Just as Chrysler would be upset if I ever treated him with respect.
Speaking of Chrysler, wasn't last week's show fun? The Zoom Christmas show? If people haven't heard that you should dial it up while it's still online and available. And that was so great.
Well, it's so cool that he was driving from Disney World back to Nashville, because when we first encountered him, he was driving the country with his poor family. He was like Clark Griswold taking his family on a year-long trip around America. What could be worse, And they stopped in North Dakota.
As you said, he was lost somewhere on the Natchez Trace.
He was talking, and I could just see his family rolling their eyes in the rest of the car as he was talking about his interest in the Thomas Jefferson Hour and so on. He's a really extraordinary man. He gave us a great gift of a new song.
Yeah, it's in last week's show, so you can hear it.
So people should listen to that. But we had Lindsay on, although she wasn't live on the Zoom. David Nicandri was chortling in his usual way out in Western Washington. Joe Ellis got all wound up. It was quite an interesting program. And Bo Wright, I exposed him on National Public Radio that he's been unceremoniously tossed out as the vice mayor of Lynchburg. And so his political career in Lynchburg, at least, was relatively short-lived.
Yeah, it was my fault, too, because I didn't put up a yard sign for him. I'm on his email list.
I told him that the rumor was out there that he had asked for the termination of the city constitution of Lynchburg, but he denied that with some firmness. So it was a great show, but this is a great show when we look back on some of the highlights of the year. I don't know how you do it. You're the one who goes and mines the programs. I know you do a description every week before you send it up on to the satellite.
A show blurb.
But you somehow remember what if you had said to me on December 1st, choose 7 or 8 of your favorite moments from the year, I would have said, how? I'm going to have to listen to the programs again.
You give me more credit than I deserve, but thank you, sir.
No, you deserve all that credit. So now, for you, you're still at it. You still have Makoche Recording Studios, and one of the great studios on the Great Plains, one of the great studios in the heartland of America.
A Mix Magazine Room of the Year, it was.
When was that?
The year it was built, 1992.
And this last year, you've done this incredible project involving Francis Densmore and cylinder discs and Native Americans, particularly in this case, the Lakota. Amazing year for you, and yet you still found time, except on those 2 occasions that you have now confessed.
Yeah.
To do to do live programs every week.
A blot on my career for sure.
That's it, And no such program next year. You're done for the moment with Frances Densmore.
Well, we'll see. There's some other interest. I mean,
there's some rumbling.
Well, she recorded tribes all over the United States, and she's got works in our part of the world, another tribes in Minnesota, other tribes in North Dakota. We'll see. I'm still in a recovery mode from that.
I would just observe that I've known you for a long time now, I suppose for 25 years, but certainly for the last 18 in a big way. I probably spend more time with you than with anybody else.
No, really?
It's true.
Dream higher, kind of sad, sir, dream higher.
Kind of sad all the way around if you think about it, but it's true. But I think around September 1st or maybe August 15th, you looked really exhausted.
Oh, did I?
Spiritually, physically, mentally. That project took an enormous amount of time and effort.
A lot of juice is what it took. You got to kind of recover and restock. But it's great. It's if I had a bucket list of work I wanted to do before I die, this was the top of the list. So,
well, I would urge. It's not for me to tell you how to spend the last few years of your life here, but
let's hope.
But the three affiliated tribes, the MHA, Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara, are of great importance to you and to me.
Yeah.
And she was there too, wasn't she?
Yeah, she kind of double dipped. You find this in her career. For people who don't know, she was born right after the Civil War in northern Minnesota in a little town called Red Wing. And when she came out here, it was her second major effort. And while she was here, she befriended people at the State Historical Society of North Dakota. And they thought, well, this is pretty good what she's doing. Let's hire her. So the only project that she did not do for the Smithsonian was to go north of Bismarck and record Mandan and Hidatsa music. And that became a project that is now stored in Bismarck, all the original cylinders up at the State Historical Society, much to the chagrin of the Smithsonian. And that project, she worked on at the same time, and that project deserves attention too. But boy, we're getting pretty far down the rabbit hole here.
We're getting into the rabbit hole here, but I hope you will do that work.
Somebody. I've got a methodology now, and somebody needs to do that for sure.
But nobody can really do it the way you do it. I've been in the editing booth with you when we've done our documentary films, and it's amazing to be the second person in that room. And I'll say, well, maybe a little more of this, and you'll say, well, this involves 7 layers of music and voice audio and stills and video clips and so on. And I'll say, but if you moved it over here, it might make it stronger. And you always turn and look at me at a certain point, like, if you were doing this, you would know how complicated this kind of work
but
is.
Not too much of a love fest here, but generally, when you did that, you were right, because you get tunnel vision when you're working on it like that for hours. Then when somebody else comes in and they go, well, if you told us what the color of the car was before the accident instead of after it, it might be more effective. And it is. It's
collaboration, and that's those memories, both of doing the Jefferson Hour as we do, but of the documentary films that we have done, are some of the great memories of my life. And to see the creative process, just to close with this, somebody sits down and watches a documentary by you, by Ken Burns, by anyone, and they think, oh, that's interesting. What they don't realize is that for every minute of that 60-minute or 30-minute piece, there are literally scores, even hundreds of decisions that had to be made. But just to say what a great time we're having, obviously we're in a really good spirit today. And it's a holiday season, so we're not overly busy. And we've been able to prolong this podcast introduction. We'll see if anybody is still listening. But this is our retrospective program on highlights from the year 2022 of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Happy holidays, everyone. And let's have a great, great 2023. Let's go to the show.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to this week's edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm your host, David Swenson, joined by the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson, and also joined by numerous guests from our shows in 2022. As we always like to do at the end of the year, we look back on some of our favorite conversations. And we start with Lindsay Chervinsky talking about Abigail Adams.
It's great to do these programs. We move so fast, 52 new programs per year, that it's often hard to remember just what transpired in any year-long calendar, David. And I love hearing some of the retrospection. So what's so amazing about Lindsay is that she brings a different lens to this. And to hear her talk about these questions is always really interesting and enlightening to me. And so I think here we're talking about whether Jefferson would have been comfortable with an outspoken woman like Abigail Adams.
Yes, and what a strong personality Abigail Adams had, and how John Adams embraced that. Let's listen, shall we?
Yes. If ever a person had a mate, a soulmate, a helpmate plus a soulmate, in some sense co-president of the United States, wife of one, mother of another, it was Abigail Smith, who later became Abigail Adams. Abigail Adams did not allow the traditional boundaries of gender or of women's roles or of women's deference to get in the way of doing the right thing. She was quietly unwilling to conform to those standards, wouldn't you say?
I would, and you bring up two excellent points. The first is that there were these standards about gender expectations, and she had a very good understanding of what they were and knew how to get around them. So when John left, she had someone appointed power of attorney, a man, because that was how the legal system worked, but who would do her bidding. So she was completely in control of any legal decisions. And part of the reason she is pretty remarkable compared to some of the other Virginian first ladies that came later is that she had a pretty robust classic education. She was reading texts that a lot of Virginian women weren't necessarily having access to. And because she was able to read those things, to go to school, to then have education in her own home, not only did that help her when John was not there and she had to raise her own children, but it meant that she could go toe-to-toe with him in these references when they're writing letters back and forth. She knew exactly what he was saying and could give just as good as she got.
And John Adams deserves some credit for being good with that. In other words, some men, and Jefferson, I think, is one of them, that would have turned the subject away from Cicero or political thought because he would have thought that that was a little too much burden for the tenderness of ladies. John Adams did not have any of that squeamishness. He was like, bring it. Let's have this conversation. You're my most trusted advisor. You are as intellectually rigorous as I am and a better judge of human character than I am. And so the fact that John was open to a strong, independent, forceful, articulate, free-thinking woman is something you probably would not have found in Jefferson's Virginia.
That's true. And you still sometimes don't find it in all men today, if I may say so. There's actually a Jane Austen quote, which I don't usually bring into our podcast, but it says, "Men of sense do not want silly wives." And I think John Adams took that concept and embraced it heartily and recognized what an asset she was to him.
At the end of January, Clay, you had a discussion with Darren Staloff, the author of Hamilton, Adams, Jefferson, The Politics of Enlightenment and the American Founding. In his book, he writes that America owes its guiding political traditions to three founding fathers whose lives embodied the collision of European enlightenment with the founding of America. He starts his conversation with you talking about all of the actual similarities between Hamilton and Jefferson.
First of all, I found the book really extraordinary, and the minute I read it, I suggested that we interview him. Now, he sees these three, Adams, Jefferson, and Hamilton, as essentially in the same mold, but with slightly different emphases. I would distinguish them more completely than that. But what strikes me is that Jefferson was a figure of the Enlightenment, but he also was a romantic. And he had this dream of an agrarian republic in which farmers would work in their fields by day and read Homer in the original Greek at night. Professor Staloff's view is that, yes, that's all true of Jefferson, but it wasn't part of his major thrust, that he was quite a pragmatist when it came to the actual policy trajectory of the country, and not that distinct from Hamilton.
Let's have a listen to a part of that conversation, shall we?
Of course. All right. Well, look, I've been so looking forward to meeting you. I love your book. I didn't know your book. I'm not a great Hamilton lover, but I picked up your book, and I'll tell you what struck me most about it was the strong case you made for Hamilton as an ideal exemplar of the Enlightenment in America. And normally I take Jefferson's view that he was an outlier and kind of a proto-capitalist who didn't understand the genius of the American experiment.
When we think about the differences between the two parties, and they were very vicious. I mean, every bit as vicious as now, maybe worse. And even between the exemplars of Hamilton and Jefferson, who had some hard feelings towards each other, it's easy to forget how much they had in common and how much they agreed on, which was probably about 80% of stuff. So, for example, Hamilton and Jefferson both wanted a popular republic. They both wanted a fiscally sound state. They both wanted ordered liberty. Exactly some of the precise configurations of that they disagreed about. Even where they disagreed, there was a lot of overlap, which is to say Hamilton certainly in his reports favored a program of manufacturing, and he wanted to advance it. He thought that was the future. To be fair, Jefferson also thought that was the future. They just had a different sense of the timing of it and how desirable it was. And if you'd asked Jefferson, in the long run, what is the future? Is it going to be manufacturing and urbanization? He would have said, yes, it's just I'm not in a rush to get there. And that's not so much a judgment of reality, because I think they agreed on a lot of that. It's a judgment of both a style of thought and of preference. Hamilton was a city slicker, and he couldn't get there fast enough. I mean, and Jefferson just wasn't. He saw that probably was going to be a future at some point, but it wasn't to his taste. I think Hamilton was, in the things he was interested about, he was actually deeper. He was a real nerd. And when he studied something, he got to the bottom of it and worked really hard. But he didn't have the breadth that Jefferson had. And that's what's really stunning about Jefferson is, of all of the founders, he definitely has the most Catholic tastes. In that he's not only reads political philosophy and moral philosophy and what we would call metaphysics and epistemology and critical religion, but he's also an aesthete. I mean, his literary tastes are impeccable. I mean, he's so incredibly well read.
It's the more remarkable that Jefferson could do this, because one of the things you say over and over again in your book is that the Enlightenment was essentially an urban phenomenon, that cities made it possible with their coffee houses and their taverns and their philosophical societies and their transactions and their printing presses and their libraries and so on, and that this is how it worked. And yet the most urbane of the founding fathers is a man who lives on an isolated mountain in the middle of nowhere in rural Virginia. And so it's the more remarkable that Jefferson was able to be that person with so little surround. Of course, David, no year is complete unless we check in several times with our West Coast Enlightenment correspondent, Mr. David Nicandri, and he is really up to date on all things Captain Cook. He has one book about James Cook already in print and another coming, and he wanted to talk about the HMS Endeavour, which was one of Cook's ships that sank in Providence Harbor in Rhode Island and has recently been rediscovered. It raises a lot of questions. Can it be resurfaced? Can divers go down with video equipment and other testing devices and to learn more about this? Or is it just one of those tricks? I mean, maybe it's just fascinating, but wouldn't necessarily lead to any new understandings of the world of James Cook. So it's always a delight to talk to David Nicandri, and he always brings a fascinating perspective to our conversations.
Yes, and in this part of the conversation, he points out that it was Cook's cartography skills that were really responsible for his successful voyages. Let's listen.
Normally, I contact David Nicandri and say, can we talk about the recent discovery of an intact mammoth, or can we have a conversation about the nature of exploration? But this time, he contacted me and said, "Citizen, there's this extraordinary discovery in Rhode Island that probably confirms that one of Cook's ships, maybe the most famous, the Endeavor, sunk in a harbor in Rhode Island." And he wanted to come on the program to talk about this exciting discovery. And he was like a child with enthusiasm for this extraordinary moment in the history of exploration. Dave, welcome to the Jefferson Hour. I think there's news in the world of Captain Cook.
Yeah, the Cook world has been literally a buzz the last week or so with the news that Captain Cook's first transoceanic craft, the Endeavor, was discovered in Newport, Rhode Island Harbor, there in Narragansett Bay. News outlets all over the world have covered it.
For those who might not know, tell us who James Cook was. Born 1728, died February 14th, 1779.
Made his reputation in the British Royal Navy during the 7 Years' War, what we in North America call the French and Indian War. Was clearly one of the top talents in the cartographic realm, came to the attention of the higher-ups in the Admiralty, so that when the combination of the Royal Society and the Royal Navy wanted to dispatch an astronomical crew to the four corners of the world, literally, Cook got that command as a mere lieutenant. The voyage was successful. He got two subsequent commissions, another epic voyage in the Southern Hemisphere that circumnavigated Antarctica, and then his third and last voyage, which commenced in the noteworthy month of July 1776 in search of the Northwest Passage, and it was on that voyage that he was killed in Hawaii.
So I think it's fair to say that his rise was based on meritocracy. He didn't come from the nobility or from one of the aristocratic families.
There was no one who was a more accomplished map maker than James Cook. It is that skill, primarily, that landed him the job for the Transit of Venus mission to Endeavor. It's also important to point out he had very able assistants who could help him accomplish this work. It's not as if Cook himself did all of the cartography associated with his voyages, but it must be said he supervised it.
David, this is fascinating. Let's take a short break, and when we come back, we'll examine other highlights from the Thomas Jefferson Hour in the year 2022.
Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour and our 2022 retrospective. We're hearing from many of our contributors, many of the conversations that we had last year.
One of the things that I inaugurated last year was our 10 Things series, and we have done a fairly large number of them, David, and one of the most interesting to me was 10 things about the painting, The Crossing of the Delaware. I think everybody knows that famous painting with George Washington standing up in the bow and the ice chunks next to him. It's a huge painting, now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. It's 21 feet wide by 12 feet high. It was painted by a man named Emanuel Lutze, and it is a truly heroic, even mythic depiction of that famous Christmas Eve crossing of the Delaware River.
This was one of my favorite conversations from last year, and I really liked that Lindsay started out by recognizing it's best if we can imagine this event from the perspective of those who were there. Shall we listen?
Yes.
Washington had lost most of his troops. The states were sort of threatening to not re-up, to not send more funds, to not send more militia. And so it just really was an extremely dire moment. And that it's easy for us to know from 2022 how it all turned out and, how they had this success. But it's really important that we, take away that present context and think about what they were feeling at that moment and how dark it actually was.
And there are three things that really strike me about this. Number one, it was a Christmas night crossing, so there's Christmas. That's daring. Secondly, this was maybe the darkest period of the war so far, and so we needed a really important symbolic pick-me-up of one type or another. This gave us that. And third, it led to a monumental painting by Emanuel Lutze, but it's iconic. It's one of those paintings that has blown beyond its importance as a piece of art to a piece of national memory. And I remember seeing it, I think it's 12 by 21 feet, so that is huge.
It's destroyed at this moment when the United States is in a all-out battle for the future of democracy globally. And a little bit of military backstory in this. There were actually supposed to be 3 separate crossings. They were supposed to cross at different places. Some of the crossings didn't actually work out because of the way the river moves and the ice flow, and it was simply too dangerous for some of the other crossings to take place. They ended up crossing later and meeting up with Washington, but so many of these figures, when they thought about the war and they thought about sacrifice and they thought about what it meant to be in the military and in the revolution, they could think of this moment as a touchstone for them. And it really was an emotional calling point for the soldiers that had been present. And so I think it's just so valuable to think about all the people, all the names we know, and to be able to kind of figure out where they were in this configuration. And the conditions were terrible. They were horrible that night. It's great to think about all these people being there and what that meant to them later on.
Just again, Washington, of course, James Monroe, who later became Jefferson's protege and the 5th president of the United States, Thomas Mifflin, William Bradford, Henry Knox, the great Alexander Hamilton, Arthur St. Clair, Joseph Reed, the painter and museum director Charles Wilson Peale. Whose idea was this, Lindsay? Who cooked up this scheme?
Well, I think it was a multi-pronged effort. There was certainly Washington was convinced by early December that some sort of action was required. A large number of troops, their enlistments had expired actually on December 1st, and they had gone home. So in, just a couple of weeks, he had lost thousands and thousands of troops. There was a conviction, I think a shared conviction among the officer corps that something had to be done.
You read about this and it's like a movie. I mean, it's hard to believe that it succeeded. There was so much working against them.
Yeah, I think this is one of those moments where it could have, Washington had a real sense that he was protected by Providence or fate and was sort of destined for bigger and better things. And when you read about the retreats from New York and then you read about this moment, it's hard not to agree with him because so much could have gone wrong, and not a single soldier and not a single piece of artillery was lost in these crossings. The odds of that happening are kind of like preposterously astronomical, and yet the fact that they all get across to the other side, we know that it goes on to be this amazing surprise. It's one of those moments where you kind of can't help feel like, yeah, maybe he was right. Maybe there is an element of providential design in this plan.
I really enjoyed that conversation. Next up, you had a one-on-one conversation with Derek Baxter, and it was about his book, In Pursuit of Jefferson, Traveling Through Europe and the Most Perplexing Founding Father. To write this book, he spent 8 years doing research and traveling to sites in Europe. He talked about how hard it was to find some of the locations, particularly the 19 gardens that Jefferson visited.
Derek Baxter and his family went to all the Jefferson sites that they could find in England, in the Low Countries, in Germany, in France, and in Italy. And he wrote this book, In Pursuit of Jefferson. David, one of the things I found remarkable in the book is that they went to all of the gardens that Jefferson went to with John Adams in England. I've never been to all of those gardens. I'm not even sure it's worth going to all of those gardens, but they did. And so that's really important work. The rest of us will benefit by his taking that big project on. It's like trying to find all the Caravaggio paintings in the world or all the Vermeer paintings that exist and going to Stuttgart and to London and to Florence and to Rome and so on. But he did it. And but what struck me about the book most is the subtitle. Give me that again.
Traveling Through Europe with the Most Perplexing Founding Father.
And guess why he's perplexing? David Baxter, like everybody else, got tripped up on slavery, and he went to several places in Europe where the slave trade was prominent, and he then, in a sense, couldn't recover his delight in Jefferson's adventure from his awareness that Jefferson was fundamentally a hypocrite with respect to questions of race and slavery. And so, in my opinion, that's a habit of historiography at the present moment. I'm not entirely sure it's altogether healthy.
Let's listen to just a short portion of that conversation between you and Derek Baxter.
it was hard to find some of these. I was looking at old maps and looking, and we'd show up to a couple of these places and they would just be like a scraggly meadow, or there'd be a little vestige of a garden that's now part of a prep school or something like that. Or the first one was a golf course. It wasn't even really a garden anymore. So yes, there was lots of different opinions about how useful that trip was. But for me, I really appreciate it because some of them are obviously amazingly preserved. Some are, some of the most famous gardens in the world. So contrasting those with other gardens, which might have been very impressive in Jefferson's time, and now there's almost nothing there, also I think was meaningful to me, just to see kind of the passage of time and how much work you have to put into preserving something.
When you're doing this, how does it help you think about Jefferson?
Jefferson was just very practical. It's such an interesting take on his travel because he was certainly capable of, sometimes wrote these very lyrical descriptions of what he saw, but most of the time it's just jotting down the notes. Like, here's, this temple looks good, the trees are here, the pond is here. I think he took back some ideas. I have to think that seeing all these in person and rating them and figuring out which gardens he liked, fed into the vision he eventually had.
So he brings a ton of stuff back with him, this gigantic shopping spree that he went on, which is sort of appalling when you consider that he didn't really have any money to pay for all of that. He brings back architectural thought, and that has a gigantic influence in the course of American history. He brings back an understanding of wine and how the wine business works and how you can ship wines and so on. And that has a significant influence. Gardening was a little less so because, and he admits, we're not quite there yet. We don't have enough wealth. We don't have enough luxury to incorporate these ideas, but he certainly wanted this kind of landscape aesthetic to be part of the American world too, didn't he?
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. It wasn't fully realized. He wrote in his guide and Hints to Americans Traveling in Europe, he wrote that gardening of the various arts is one that America actually could achieve quicker than, doing fine paintings, like you would see the old masters doing, because they have the plants. And he said, in fact, we've got the gardens. You just have to cut out the super abundant plants and the garden will emerge. Of course, it's a lot of work. And the work was being done in the South by enslaved people, for sure.
For me, there are two huge perplexities in Jefferson's 1787 trip. Number one, that he didn't go on to Rome and Naples and so on, because we just want him to continue down the spine of Italy. That's number one. And number two, as you point out in perplexity, why didn't he go see the Palladian villas when he was within a day or two of them?
It must have been frustrating for Jefferson. And to give the context, in case everyone doesn't know, he was ambassador to France. He went to South. He took leave to go to Aix-en-Provence, ostensibly to take the hot waters there because he had broken his wrist. He thought soaking in the waters would help them. Of course, Jefferson got bored after a few days of soaking and quit the treatment. It was a bit of a pretext. He had wanted to go to the south of France even before that. And he also thought there could be some public benefit to his trip. He was going to investigate the different seaports in France, like Marseille and Bordeaux, and investigate, how could he help American commerce, which was his job. So he went down there and he was so close. He was obviously dying to go to Italy. He had grown up reading the classics, and the founders and that generation of America just idolized, of American leaders idolized the Romans, kind of like we do to some extent to the founders today. So he read Latin, he knew the stories, he really wanted to go. He hit on a reason to go to northwestern Italy to investigate the kind of rice they had, which was a legitimate reason, and I think related enough to his job as ambassador. He wanted to see if there was a different kind of rice that planters in the Carolinas could plant.
He talked about Jefferson and Rice. Can you tell that story, Clay?
David, it's one of my favorite stories. Jefferson made a tour of southern France, particularly in the summer of 1787. He went to a range of vineyards and made arrangements to get wine shipped over to the United States, etc. And he was fascinated by a strain of rice that held up better than the South Carolina strains that he was used to in the United States. And so he went to Nice in southern France looking for it, couldn't find what he wanted, and then only decided to cross the Alps and go into northern Italy to Milan in hopes of seeing this rice and seeing the machine that husked it and so on. When he saw this strain in Milan or near Milan, he decided it was superior to the rice grown in the United States. And as you know, Jefferson once said, "He who introduces a new plant species has done the greatest service to his country." And so he then wanted to bring that rice back, but it was a capital crime to export it in its raw state. And so Jefferson, he did it anyway. So Jefferson took a couple of handsful of that rice and put it in his pockets and carried it across the border into France, and then brought it back to the U.S. and did dutifully sent it to South Carolina, but they decided that it wasn't superior. This was an agricultural setback for Jefferson and the Enlightenment, but he was perfectly willing to smuggle the rice, even at the possible expense of his head.
Well, let's move on to another conversation from May last year called Original Argument. And the original argument was between Jefferson and Hamilton about a national bank. Actually, this is from our podcast intro. We talked to Jefferson about it, but this is you and I discussing the original argument.
This edition is one close to our hearts because...
Yeah, I hope it's not too dry.
I don't think so. It's about, it's the dry part is the National Bank of the United States, but the interesting part is that Hamilton and Jefferson were asked by the great George Washington, the first president, to write a memo each about whether a national bank was constitutional, whether the U.S. Constitution authorized Congress creating a national bank of the United States. And Jefferson famously said no. He's a strict constructionist. It's not enumerated in the Constitution.
And Hamilton said yes.
Do you want to be a great nation that's going to have to make some adjustments? And you don't want every time that you want an adjustment to have to go to the process of a constitutional amendment or a new constitutional convention. Come on, folks. We need some fundamental good sense and flexibility in this.
It was either you or Jefferson who brought up, I think it was Jefferson who brought up this complex series of events that Hamilton wanted to...
He wanted three things. He wanted to assume the national debt and pay it off, including the state debts. That was number one. Number two, he wanted a national banking system, a national bank, to coordinate this, which makes a certain kind of sense. And number three, he wanted to... it's called mercantilism. He wanted to fund infant industry so the United States could begin to compete with Great Britain.
And that's what I thought was pretty interesting. Is he wanted to create tax breaks for certain companies that they liked, and a lot of it sounds fairly modern.
It's what we do.
Yeah, we do, and we go back to this argument to find out the origins of it.
Well, Hamilton believed that we were going to be a great commercial world power with a strong military and a central government that was flexible enough to do all the things that it might possibly want to do, which is exactly what we've become. And Jefferson believed that we were a kind of unique in human history experiment in severely limited government, and it would be worth our while to try to be pure to that as long as we possibly could. As you like to say, he also doubled the size of the United States with an unconstitutional
I didn't
purchase.
have a problem doing that one.
Well, nobody does. I mean, look, if someone came to you tonight and offered you the whole city block, you would say, of course. Of course.
Yes.
When the lottery comes to you in that way, you have to say yes, but it did compromise Jefferson's principles. And by the way, David, Frederick Jackson Turner, in his famous essay of 1893 called The Significance of the Frontier in American History, said, when Jefferson purchased Louisiana in 1803, he essentially killed the Republic, because to administer that much territory was going to require much, 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 much more government than could ever have been contemplated by the Founding Fathers.
If Jefferson understood the importance of, let's say, a national library or a national museum, he would say, I really like that idea. Pass an amendment.
Yes, he said that. So you and I have a very important example of this, David, because we're both lovers of Lewis and Clark. So when Lewis comes back, he brings back this immense treasury of bear necklaces and fur robes.
And had there been
a Smithsonian, those things would have been saved. And Jefferson said no. Charles Wilson Peale, the great museum innovator in Philadelphia, and the person who wound up with a lot of the treasures of the Lewis and Clark expedition, wrote to Jefferson and said basically, well, don't you think that it's about time for us to have a national museum? and Jefferson, who loved this idea. I mean, of course you want the Smithsonian. Of course you want the National Art Gallery.
But it wasn't constitutional.
But it wasn't there. And so Jefferson wrote back and said two things. He said, my friend, however desirable this is, we must first pay off the national debt. That's our moral duty. And secondly, since it wasn't enumerated or contemplated, we have to go back to the people and get an amendment that authorizes this sort of thing. He also wanted a national university. He wanted national libraries, etc. But he said, no. However desirable these are, we can't just do them because they're good and desirable. We must find specific authorization in the social compact of the United States, and I don't see it, so I won't do it.
So if we have anybody in history to blame for a bloated government, it's Alexander Hamilton. He led us down that path.
There's your musical on Broadway.
Yeah, well, I need to go back and make sure my justification was correct.
They're two of the greatest men who ever lived in the United States. They're extraordinarily talented writers and persuaders. And Washington turned to these two colossi, these two giants of American political thinking, and said, all right, what's the right thing to do? He didn't have to do that. He could have just either signed it or not signed it, but he turned to them, and they each wrote a classic.
That really was one of my favorite conversations with President Jefferson. So with that, we're going to take a short break. When we come back, we'll be joined by one of the titans of the Jefferson Hour contributors, Mr. Joe Ellis. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Welcome back to this special edition of the Year in Review 2022. Every year at this time, we look back on the 52 programs we have recorded for that year and pick out some of the most interesting moments to share, not only with our listeners across the country and even across the world, but we enjoy it ourselves to look back on what we have managed to accomplish in that calendar year. And I'll say this, David, I've said it before on the Jefferson Hour, that COVID-19 was one of the most disruptive events of my lifetime. And it had a really extraordinary disruptive effect on the world's economy, on our educational systems, on the small businesses across this country and elsewhere. But it did give us one enormous gift. It gave us Joe Ellis. He had been a very occasional guest on this program, but because he was sheltered and we were sheltered and Zoom technology had suddenly come into the play, we were able to communicate with him on a regular basis, and he's added so much depth and such an extraordinary set of insights to the Jefferson Hour that it would be wrong-headed for us to do a retrospective for any recent year without including a Joseph Ellis highlight.
And this conversation, which we recorded in June, was about the Enlightenment. And Joseph Ellis says that the very basis of the Enlightenment was truth and truth-seeking, and he feels that the filibuster is unconstitutional. I found that very interesting. Let's have a listen, shall we?
Yes. Here's what I think the founding was about. Joe says it's about this discussion, this argument about the meaning of the revolution, or you might put it another way, the meaning of a republic. And so most of them agreed that we want a republic. They weren't altogether certain of what that exactly meant, but we know some things about it. They meant that the people were sovereign and that the people were going to generate the social compact and then ratify it state by state and so on. But here's the big argument. Here's the discussion that they were having. If the people are sovereign, do we just listen to their will to the extent that we can discern it and enact that into law? Or do we filter and distill their will by way of a number of different distilling mechanisms, some of which check and balance each other? And Adams was always for checks and balances, Mr. Jefferson, checks and balances. And Jefferson agreed to a certain degree, but he was more naive, let's say, or more optimistic.
He had greater faith in the wisdom of the common man. He did.
Right, to govern themselves, right?
The word republic is the key, and we need to recognize that the American Revolution was, in fact, a genuine intellectual political revolution. It was to say that power did not flow from God to monarchs and downward to feudal lords It flowed upward from that mystic thing called the people. It's a reversal of the whole idea of what government represents. And in the late 18th century, the key term was republic, res publica, things of the public. The word democracy, even for Jefferson, he changes about 1816 on this, but up until then, democracy is an epithet. You accuse somebody of being a Democrat because a democracy is a form of government in which popular opinion, which is always subject to demagogic manipulation and often takes the form of mob rule. And they're thinking back to Rome and Tacitus and Cicero, that you don't want to have a democracy. What you want to have is just what you said, Clay, namely, popular opinion stands at the foundation, but then on the foundation is built government, which filters this popular opinion through channels of refinement. And the commitment is not to the people. The commitment is to the public. And so what we want the Senate to do and what we want a president to do and what we want the Supreme Court to do is not be influenced by fads of the moment, but to see the long-term interest of the republic. And you can disagree about that. But you have to recognize that your highest goal is not to be elected to the Senate, but to act in ways that if it causes your defeat in the next election, that's no problem. It might be a problem for you, but the public interest has to take precedence over the popular interest.
I listened to you just now, Joe, and you said popular opinion stands at the foundation. And maybe that's the way it was intended, and I'm looking at this and going, three branches of government, well, it's not working out so great. We've got a situation in America now where minority rules in the Senate because of the filibuster. The Supreme Court has become, as I think you would both agree, very politicized. And we have gone through presidential changes. The norms and decorum of the office have been thrown out. So it's a bit dicey now, isn't it?
Well, I mean, if you gathered the founders together, and of course, you can't do that. And trying to bring the founders into the present is like trying to plant cut flowers. And Jefferson himself said, look, don't do that. Don't do that. What we have done at our moment in history is consolidate the wisdom of our moment, but don't look back to us. And Jefferson even said that the Constitution ought to be redone every 20 years. Every generation needed to have its own version of the Constitution, which of course would have been chaos. But I think that what you're saying is true, and in the present, if you ask me, and of course I confer with the founders on a daily basis by reading their letters, so I sort of think they're talking to me. And what they say to me is, first of all, what is this thing called the filibuster? We never had that. We specified 3 or 4 occasions in the Constitution where a vote in the Senate had to be a supermajority. Go to war, overthrow a presidential veto, or pass a Supreme Court amendment. And also approve all treaties. That's 4 things. Everything else was supposed to be a strict majority vote. If it's a filibuster or cloture, that is unconstitutional, in my judgment. It's a procedural change that has made a constitutional change. And that to me means it is unconstitutional.
At last fall, in September, I invited Joe Ellis to return to the show so that you and he could reflect on the life of David McCulloch. Let's listen to the two of you talk about him.
I was friends with David. We did some things together. The most important was we testified before a subcommittee of the House for the construction of a memorial to Abigail and John Adams on the Mall. And he was great in that moment. And he brought the prestige of his work in the past. But I would actually say that only one person, Ken Burns, has influenced more Americans and made them more aware of what their history was and is than our man. And his body of work is extraordinarily impressive. There ought to be, I was thinking of calling up Ken Burns and saying, Ken, I think you should do a special called The Work of David McCulloch, or The Vision of David McCulloch for America. And Lord knows, in this divided political environment, we need to be able to talk about things that bring us together in our understanding of who we are as a people and a nation. And I think David had an instinct for that. His goal is to render as a witness, and he does a great job at that.
It's sad that he's left us, but we still have his books to read and to reread.
Maybe the last American historian who still wrote his books on a manual typewriter.
Right. And then, sir, we go to October, and Mr. Jefferson joins us again, once again, portrayed by you, sir, in a conversation titled Responsibilities and Books. And this was prompted by a listener question, inquiries about banning books and citizens' rights and responsibilities.
I love it when we get listener questions that create a program. That's my favorite form of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. So Jefferson was one of the great articulators of the concept of virtually unlimited freedom of expression. Not 100% unlimited, but almost entirely. And he believed that the truth would defeat error in a fair fight, that good sense would triumph over nonsense, that science would triumph over superstition. And now we see waves of book banning, even book burning, and it's very disturbing from the point of view of the Enlightenment, and nobody better to talk about this with than Thomas Jefferson.
Let's go to that conversation now. Mr. Jefferson, it would be safe to say that you would oppose banning books, even if the ideas were ones you strongly disagreed with. Am I correct?
Yes, in the preamble to the Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty, which was published in 1786, I say that the truth is great and will prevail when left to itself, that that when government gets involved in the free exchange of ideas, it inevitably distorts that process, and that the only ideas that need government support are bad ones, that in a fair contest, truth will win over falsehood, that good sense will win over nonsense, and that we need to be confident that the truth is more potent in the long run than anything that is untruth or superstitious or conspiracy. So I believe very strongly that this trial must be made. Look, I suffered. You know that I was accused of being an atheist all of my life, which is not at all true. That I was accused of being a dangerous Jacobin, that my principles were too radical, that I'd been Frenchified, that I had stayed in France too long, that I was not reliable in some sense of order and protection of property, and so on. And so, of course, I would have loved to shut down those presses and prosecute those ruffians people who didn't know me, who had no idea who I was, but nevertheless wrote scurrilous attacks on my life and character and damaged the serenity of my children and grandchildren and my closest friends. Of course, I would have liked to stop them. Everyone wants to shut down that kind of abuse, but to do so is to enter a kind of road to authoritarianism. And the question I always ask is, who gets to decide? Do I get to decide what gets published? Does George Washington get to decide? Does Benedict Arnold get to decide? Does Aaron Burr get to decide? This is a power that can be very easily abused by anybody who embraces it. And so the best thing for us to do, and believe me, it was agonizingly hard, is to withdraw, say nothing, and assume that the public will sort out these vicious attacks that are made in the press from time to time, and largely that was the case.
Clay, finally, and I think this is appropriate that Jefferson gets the last word, another conversation with Mr. Jefferson as portrayed by you, and this came from October, the wall of separation. And we talk with Jefferson about his famous letter that he wrote to the Danbury Baptists in 1802, saying it was not the duty of government to do anything that might be interpreted as the establishment of religion.
So this is maybe Jefferson's greatest achievement. He believed more strongly than anything else in his life that the mind should be utterly free and uncoerced, that there should be no penalty and there should be no benefit for thinking what you think, and that government has absolutely no right to get involved in your conscience or your thinking unless it breaks out into crime. But if it's just language, then that's protected in any free society. And of the three things Jefferson wanted to be remembered for, the Declaration of Independence, the University of Virginia, the centerpiece was the Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty, which is one of the greatest of all articulations of that principle.
So now we join President Jefferson for that conversation.
The phrase wall of separation between church and state is a figurative phrase. In other words, there isn't a literal wall. It's not made of bricks and mortar. Using that metaphor was unusual for me. The metaphors that I tended to use in similes in my writing were about the ship of state, and you can find innumerable instances of that. The ship has come safely into port, and we've weathered the storm of the Federalists, and so on and so forth. But this was an unusual moment for me, and that signified that this was a moment when I was really stepping back and trying to find precisely the right language for this. It was never intended to be an official document. It was written by the person who happened to be the President of the United States. I was assuring the Baptists of Danbury that as far as I was concerned, they were safe to pursue their religion, which they would not have been had there not been this principle growing in the United States that every person was entitled to worship the God of his choice without civil reward or civil penalty, but that it should in the 20th century, long after my time, have been adopted by the Supreme Court of the United States as a tight paraphrase of the purposes, the principle of the First Amendment, is striking to me. It slightly embarrasses me because I don't want to be the center of attention in that way. But I will say that, as far as I'm concerned, it is the tightest possible paraphrase of the intention of Mr. Madison and the Founding Fathers when they wrote the First Amendment of the Constitution.
So it's fair to say this is something you feel very strongly about, sir.
This is something I feel more strongly about than almost anything else. On my tombstone, the obelisk at Monticello in the cemetery, the graveyard, I said I wanted to be remembered for three things, just three: the Declaration of Independence, the University of Virginia, but at the center, the Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty, which was, at the time, the most radical statement ever made about separation of church and state. That preceded the letter to the Danbury Baptists by several decades. So, yes, I do feel extremely strongly about this. I believe that when the mind and the conscience are free, all other freedoms are available to us. But when the mind and the conscience are not free, are enslaved by tyranny or priestcraft or superstition or coercion, that the other freedoms of life become less satisfying, in fact, less available. So what one privately believes is absolutely sovereign. And unless it leads to some sort of antisocial behavior, unless it leads to crime, it must be left unmolested, and by which I mean entirely unmolested, by governing bodies at any level.
So, Clay, that's it. A very small sampling of all the conversations on the Jefferson Hour in 2022. And I just love going through these and remembering the conversations.
Lots of new things happened in 2022. New things are coming in 2023. But our goal is to be a place where people can go to hear thoughtful discussion, argument in the best sense of the term. In other words, not shouting and name-calling, but disagreeing. So everyone, thank you for listening through this year. You can go back and listen to all 52 episodes if you like, and more.
And Happy New Year.
We're looking forward to a great 2023, and we will see you all next week for another exciting edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program, Through the Eyes of Thomas Jefferson.